I've never been one to scare easily. Work, college, busy routine. I arrive so exhausted at the end of the day that I rarely notice what is happening around me. But that night, something was wrong. I took the last bus as I always did, already accustomed to the smell of old seats and the monotonous noise of the engine. The bus was almost empty. Just a man napping in the back, and a woman playing on her cell phone a few rows in front. I sat by the window, put on my headphones, and let tiredness overcome me. But after a few minutes, something made me take off the headphones. The bus went straight past a stop where someone was always getting off. I looked ahead, hoping the driver would realize his mistake, but he continued driving, impassive. At first, I thought he was just distracted, but then I noticed it wasn't just that stop. The bus ignored the next one as well, and the next one. The streets were becoming deserted, darker, as if we were heading to a part of the city I didn't recognize. I looked at the other passengers waiting for some reaction, but the man was still dozing, and the woman was playing with her cell phone, as if nothing was happening. And discomfort began to grow in my chest. I picked up my cell phone to check my GPS location, but the screen showed something strange. The little blue ball wasn't on any known street, just an empty space on the map. That's when I started to feel real fear. I swallowed and looked out the window again. The streets were increasingly deserted, without shops, without lit lampposts, without any sign of life. It seemed like the bus was going to a place that shouldn't exist. I turned to the woman, hoping she too had noticed something wrong. "Hey," I called softly, but she didn't even look up from her cell phone. I leaned over a little and saw the screen. It was off. She swiped her finger as if she were touching something, but the screen was completely black. My stomach sank. I looked back, and the elderly man was still in the same position, with his head down, breathing very shallowly, as if he were in a deep sleep or dead. That's when I decided to talk to the driver. I got up and walked down the hall, trying to ignore the feeling that something didn't want me to get to him. With each step, my heart accelerated. "Excuse me," I said, trying to sound calm. "Nothing." "Hey, mister. You went right past some stops." No response. That's when I noticed. The guy was staring in the rearview mirror, and it wasn't at the road. He was looking at me. It didn't blink. He didn't move his head. The eyes reflected the faint glow of the bus dashboard, and for a moment I was sure that the look was not human. A shiver ran up my spine, and I stopped in the middle of the hallway, not knowing what to do. The silence inside the bus felt heavier now, as if the air itself had grown thicker. I wanted to believe it was just a strange driver, perhaps distracted, but something inside me screamed that it wasn't that. That gaze fixed on the rearview mirror, without blinking, without deviating. It seemed like he was waiting for something from me. I took a step back, trying to think of what to do, when I noticed something else. The steering wheel. He wasn't moving. The bus continued moving forward, turning corners and accelerating on straights, but the driver's hands were completely still, resting on the dashboard. My mind refused to accept what my eyes saw. How was that possible? I looked out the window again, trying to find some landmark, but the streets were unrecognizable. There were no houses, there were no shops, there was nothing but dimly blinking streetlights and endless asphalt. I grabbed my cell phone again, desperate to see where I was, but now the GPS wasn't even loading. The signal was completely gone. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. I needed to get out of there. I went to the exit door and pressed the stop button several times. The sound of the warning echoed throughout the bus, but the driver did not react. He didn't even reduce his speed. My breathing was heavy, and an irrational panic began to take over me. I turned to the other passengers, waiting for a reaction, anything, but it was as if they weren't really there. The woman continued to use her turned-off cell phone, her fingers sliding across the dark screen, while the old man in the back didn't move. My stomach dropped at the possibility that he was dead. But I couldn't think about that now. I needed to leave. I went to the door and tried to force it with my hands, pushing with all my strength, but it was as if it were sealed. It didn't even move an inch. That's when I heard a low noise, something like a whisper coming from behind me. I turned my face slowly, afraid of what I would see. The driver remained motionless, but now his mouth was slightly open. It wasn't normal. It seemed like he was moving his lips without making a sound, as if he was murmuring something he didn't want me to hear. My skin crawled all over. I took a step back, feeling my heart in my throat, when I realized something even worse. His eyes. For the first time since I saw him, he blinked. But it wasn't a normal blink. The eyelids closed slowly, as if they were heavy, and when they opened again, the eyes were no longer the same. The pupils seemed to dilate and occupy all the space, turning black, without any trace of white. It was enough to make me step back so fast I almost tripped. My entire body was screaming at me. To run, but where to run? The bus moved forward, as if it were on an infinite path, and with every second I felt more trapped. I tried shouting at the other passengers, shaking the woman by the shoulder, but she continued with that repetitive movement, her fingers sliding across the unlit screen as if she were trapped in a trance. The old man in the back. I didn't want to look again. Something told me that if I looked, I would see something I couldn't forget. So I turned to the only possible exit, the window. I grabbed the edge and tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge either. It was as if the entire bus was a closed cocoon, a sealed space where normal rules didn't apply. That's when the driver moved. Slowly, as if taking advantage of my desperation, he turned his face towards me for the first time. That dark, empty look pierced me like a needle. He was still mumbling something, his lips moving strangely, as if he were articulating words I couldn't understand. But then he smiled. Not a human smile, not a smile I've ever seen before. It was something stretched, artificial, as if the skin on his face was being pulled to form an expression that didn't belong to him. It was enough to make me lose any control. I started punching the window, kicking the glass with all my strength, screaming for help. But outside, there was no one. There was nothing. Just darkness and increasingly spaced streetlights, until the bus was traveling on a road that I knew shouldn't exist. My vision blurred for a moment, and a ringing began to fill my ears, as if something was pressing against my head from the inside. I felt dizzy, weak, like I was being drained. I turned back to the driver, and he was still there, motionless, with that wrong smile and black eyes, still muttering without a sound. It was at that moment that something strange happened. The bus's lights flashed several times, and for a split second, everything went completely dark. I couldn't see anything, not even my own hands. And then, silence. When the lights came back on, I was sitting on the bench as if nothing had happened. The bus was normal, following a familiar street. The woman was still there, now actually using her cell phone, and the old man was still dozing. The driver was someone else. An ordinary guy, neither young nor old, with a normal face, driving like any other day. My fists were sore, as if I had actually punched something, and my heart was still hammering in my chest. But everything seemed in order. I looked out the window and saw that I was already close to my stop. I got up, still feeling my head spinning, and when the bus stopped, I got off without saying anything. I never took that route at night again. I never took the last bus again. To this day, I don't know what happened that night, but sometimes, when I'm walking late at night and see an empty bus passing by, I get that same shiver down my spine, as if, at any moment, that thing could recognize me again. I work as a night security guard in a medium-sized shopping mall in a city not worth naming. The early morning shift was never the worst, just a routine of watching cameras, prowling the empty hallways, and, every now and then, dealing with some stupid teenager trying to break into the cinema after hours. But the worst part was always the parking. There, almost every night, someone would appear to sleep in the darkest corners, beggars or addicts who came to hide from the cold. I never had the patience for that kind of thing. I always thought that the mall was not a shelter, and that, if I let one stay, the next day I would have a dozen. So my job was to get these people out of there, sometimes through conversation, sometimes the hard way. That night it was raining lightly, just an insistent drizzle that made everything seem even more depressing. At the end of my patrol, there he was again. A dirty old man with a dirty blanket, huddled in the corner between two cars. I had seen this guy a few times before, but he insisted on coming back. I asked him to leave. He mumbled something and didn't even move. Patience is over. I grabbed his arm and pulled him out, and when he resisted, I pushed hard. The old man fell to the wet floor, the blanket tangling around his legs. "This is no place for you," I said, throwing his bag of junk away. The man looked at me strangely, with deep, dark eyes, and mumbled something I didn't understand. Only later, when it all started, did I realize that it seemed like a curse. The next day, everything seemed normal, until it didn't. I started to feel strange. It was like something was out of place, but I couldn't tell what. At first it was just little things. A chill on the back of my neck as I walked through the empty parking lot. A feeling that someone was watching me when I was alone in the security room. In the middle of the night, while I was doing my rounds, I heard footsteps. Clear, firm, echoing off the concrete. I turned around, quickly, but there was no one. I walked to the end of the hallway and looked around. Absolute silence. I thought it could be all in my head, maybe tiredness. But when I got back to the monitoring room, I saw something that made me freeze. One of the cameras in the parking lot had captured movement. The screen showed a dark shadow crossing the corridor between the cars, a human shape, slow, dragging. The problem? That hallway was empty when I passed by. I replayed the tape 3 times, trying to understand. The silhouette looked familiar, the hunched posture, the way it moved. My stomach sank. That was the old man. The same old man I kicked out the night before. The same one I pushed to the ground. But it couldn't be him. I saw him leaving. I saw him disappear down the street. And yet, there he was, walking across the parking lot as if he had never left. I tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was a new beggar. Maybe someone had broken into the parking lot. I took the flashlight and went to check it out for myself. I walked down the aisles between the cars, each step echoing louder than it should have. The silence was heavy, as if the air itself had grown thicker. My heart started to beat faster. Instinct told me something was wrong. I looked in the dark corners, under the vehicles, but there was nothing. Just emptiness and the muffled sound of rain outside. I was about to turn back when I heard it again. Footsteps. But that time, they were right behind me. I jumped, around, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Nobody. I took a deep breath and ran back to the security room. As soon as I closed the door, I went straight to the monitors. My stomach sank. On the screens, in the empty corridors, at the entrances and exits. He was there. The old man. On all cameras, standing still, watching. But when I looked directly at the place where he was supposed to be, there was nothing. Just the cold light and empty hallways. My blood ran cold. My own reflection in the screen glass trembled nervously. But then, something changed. The reflection wasn't right. Behind me, there was another silhouette, a distorted shadow. The same lean, curved body, the same deep gaze. The old man was there, right behind me. I turned around so fast I almost knocked over the chair. Nothing, just the dark room and the blinking monitors. But I knew what I had seen. Fear spread through my body like an electric shock. I needed to get out of there. I grabbed the keys, checked the radio. No signal, and headed straight to the parking lot exit. My boots echoed too loudly on the concrete. Each sound seemed multiplied. My chest tightened with the knowledge that I wasn't alone. With each step, the feeling of something following me grew stronger. I was being watched. I felt a shiver run up my spine, and without meaning to, my eyes strayed to one of the cars parked nearby. The glass reflected my pale face, and his. The old man was behind me again. It was instinctive. I jumped away. From the reflection, my heart pounding in my ear. But when I turned around, the hallway was empty. Desperation made me run. I went up the stairs to the main entrance of the mall, but the door was locked. The access card didn't work. Drug. My chest rose and fell, sweat dripping down my forehead. That's when I heard it, that murmur, the same hoarse voice as last night, low, slurred, saying something that my mind refused to understand. I turned slowly, every cell in my body screaming at me not to do this. And there he was, in the middle of the corridor, between the cars. The old man. But he wasn't the way I remembered him. His skin looked grayer, his deep-set eyes were completely black. He smiled, a smile that shouldn't exist on that face. My body locked up. It was as if I was glued to the ground, unable to react. The old man took a step forward, and the sound of his foot scraping the concrete echoed in an impossible way, as if space itself was distorting around him. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. I could only look at that smile. He was too wide, his yellowed, jagged teeth showing beneath his chapped lips. The eyes, two dark caves, reflected an emptiness that seemed to pull my soul inside. Then, he whispered something. It was low, almost a breath, but I understood perfectly. Now you're the one with nowhere to go. Something inside me broke. My body finally reacted, and I ran, without thinking, without looking back. But no matter where I went, the old man was there. Every reflection, every glass, every camera showed him standing still, watching me. I tried to lock myself in the security room, but as soon as I closed the door, all the screens flashed at once. A loud noise, like static, filled the room. When the images came back, there was only one thing on the screens: my own face. But it wasn't me. It was me with those deep black eyes, with that impossible smile. I found myself blinking, moving my head, but I wasn't doing any of that. I wanted to scream, but my voice didn't come out. I could only fall back, shaking. Panic took over me. My breathing was so fast that my chest hurt. I needed to get out of there. I stumbled to my feet and ran to the security room door. But as soon as my hand touched the handle, I felt a biting cold run up my arm. It was like something was pulling me back, rooting me in that place. The monitor behind me started to squeak again, and against my will I looked back. The screen now showed the parking lot, but not the one now, but the recording from the previous night. There I was, pushing the old man, throwing his things away, ignoring his murmurs. Only this time, something was different. After I turned my back, the old man stood still, looking directly at the camera. He knew he was being filmed. He smiled, and then he muttered something while pointing at me. The recording began to skip, full of interference, until the screen froze in a single frame. The old man staring at the camera, his eyes now completely black. It was enough to make me run away. I knocked on the door, screamed for help, but no one heard me. The radio remained silent. My entire body was shaking. I turned to the monitors one last time, and that's when I realized. The old man was no longer on camera. He wasn't in any reflection, because now he was after me. I felt an icy breath on the back of my neck, a dense, crushing presence. I closed my eyes tightly. I didn't want to see. I didn't want to, know what would happen if I looked. But then his voice came again, now closer than ever, as if it were inside my own head. Now, it's your turn. In a last attempt at my sanity, I realized that running away wouldn't solve anything. I gathered strength and, trembling, decided to face what I myself had awakened. I opened the door slowly and walked down the hallway, feeling the intense cold mix with the guilt that consumed me. There, at the end of the tunnel, I found the old man, or what was left of him, standing under the flickering light of an old streetlight. His black eyes stared at me with a menacing calm, and the voice that had haunted me so much now sounded like an invitation, or perhaps a judgment. "Accept your guilt," he murmured, and at that moment I felt it was time to atone for my sins. My breathing was ragged, but I took courage. I spoke words of regret that I never imagined I would say. The corridor seemed to close as his presence intensified, and I knew that this meeting was the only path to a possible rescue of my tormented soul. With my heart pounding and my eyes teary, I decided to follow what seemed to be the only way out: redemption. I got down on my knees right there, in the dim light, and surrendered to what I had caused. The atmosphere became charged. My every breath was accompanied by a deafening silence, and for a brief moment, I felt like time had stopped. The old man remained motionless, his figure blurring, while his words were lost in the immensity of the corridor. It was then that, in the blink of an eye, everything stopped. The presence, the cold, the fear, disappeared like mist at dawn. When I came to, I realized that I had survived and that somehow that curse had been broken. I still don't fully understand what happened, but I know that today I carry the mark of that day and the painful lesson that some mistakes can never be forgotten. I was never one to believe these road stories, but what happened to me and my girlfriend on that trip made me rethink a lot of things. We had left the city to spend the weekend at an inn in the countryside, an isolated place, surrounded by bush and with almost no cell phone signal. The road was long, full of curves, without lighting, and with very few cars passing by. At first, everything seemed normal. The sun was setting, and the only strange thing was the silence around us. But then, I noticed the white truck in the rearview mirror. At first, I didn't care. Just one more car on the road. But over time, I realized that she never overtook us, never lagged behind, always at the same exact distance, as if she were just following us. I mentioned it to my girlfriend, trying not to seem paranoid. She looked in the rearview mirror and shrugged. "Coincidence," he said. But I no longer thought that. I tried accelerating a little, and the truck did the same. I slowed down, and she slowed down, too. No overtaking, no variation in pace. Just there, constant. The strangest thing? I couldn't see the driver's face. The windshield was too dark, as if there was a reflection that prevented you from seeing inside. My stomach turned. I tried to convince myself that it was just someone on the same route as us, going somewhere on that deserted road. But the discomfort didn't go away. And when we finally stopped for gas, the truck disappeared. I let out a relieved sigh, but that bad feeling was still stuck inside me. While we were filling up, we stayed there for a few minutes, stretching our legs and buying some things at the convenience store. The gas station attendant seemed like the kind of guy who'd seen it all on that road, so half-jokingly, I asked if he'd ever heard of a white pickup truck driving around there. He just raised his eyebrows and shrugged. "There are a lot of strange people around these parts," he said, without giving much importance. My girlfriend laughed in my face, saying I was traveling too much. Maybe he really was. But when we got back on the road, my heart sank. She was there again. I don't know where it came from because the track was empty when we left the gas station. But the white truck appeared behind us as if it had never left us. Only this time it was closer. Much closer. Enough for me to see that the headlights seemed dimmer, as if they were covered in some layer of dirt or rust. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling my throat go dry. This was not normal. The road was increasingly isolated, just bushes on both sides, with no shoulder and no easy exit. It was just me, my girlfriend, and that truck chasing us. My entire body was tense. My girlfriend realized that I wasn't taking it as a joke anymore and started to get nervous too. "Speed up, see if he loses," she suggested, and I didn't even hesitate. I stepped on the accelerator. The engine roared, and the speedometer rose quickly. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. The truck not only followed, but now seemed even closer. I could feel her presence glued to our car, the dim headlights seeming to flicker in a strange way. I wanted to see the driver's face, but every time I tried to focus, it was like something was stopping me from seeing anything other than a dark blur. Despair began to take over. I didn't know what else to do. If he continued accelerating, he would run the risk of losing control of the car on that curvy road. If I stopped, I knew that thing would catch up to us. So I made the only decision that seemed to make sense. On impulse, I turned the steering wheel onto a dirt road that appeared out of nowhere to our right. The car jolted, the sound of the tires kicking up dust filled our ears, and for a moment I thought we had managed to lose the truck. But when we got back to the main road, my heart almost stopped. There she was, not back, not coming towards us, but parked on the side of the road, waiting. But now, completely destroyed. I braked sharply, almost skidding on the asphalt. My girlfriend let out a scream, and for a few seconds we just stared at it, trying to understand what the hell was happening. It was the same truck, same color, same model, same threatening presence. But now, it was burned, twisted, as if it had been destroyed years ago in an accident. The hood was dented, the windows were shattered, and the metal had dark soot marks, as if it had caught fire. The tires were just carcasses, reduced to scraps of melted rubber. The worst, she had been there for a long time. Weeds grew around it, as if no one had moved it for years. But how was that possible, if that same truck had just chased us? My mind tried to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. I looked at my girlfriend, waiting for her to say something, but she just stared back at me, pale, hands shaking in her lap. The silence inside the car was absolute, only broken by the sound of the engine still running. It was then that I did the worst thing possible. I looked in the rearview mirror, and my heart froze. Behind the car, on the empty road, right where the truck should have been, I saw the dim headlights come on. I didn't think. I just sped up. The car lurched forward, the tires squealed on the asphalt, and I pushed as hard as I could to get out of there as quickly as possible. My girlfriend squeezed my arm, scared, but I couldn't say anything. I just drove, trying not to look in the rearview mirror anymore. But even without looking, I felt it. I felt that presence behind us. The dim headlights, the almost silent engine, that thing following us, ignoring any logic. My chest felt tight, as if a weight was pushing down on my heart. Every second felt like an eternity. Until, out of nowhere, it disappeared. There was no sound of the engine leaving, no turns where she could have left the road. I just looked in the rearview mirror again, and the truck was no longer there, as if it had never existed. Neither the headlights nor the suffocating presence, just the dark road and the wind shaking the trees around. Nobody ever believed this story when we told it. But to this day, whenever I see a white pickup truck on the road, I feel butterflies in my stomach, because deep down, I know she's still out there, waiting. I moved into that apartment downtown at the beginning of the fall. It was small, a little cramped, but the rent fit my budget and the location was great. The building was old, with those narrow corridors and the smell of old wood mixed with cheap cleaning products. When I visited the place, the owner, a thin, bald man with an always tense expression, mentioned a peculiar detail. One of the rooms was locked and could not be opened. "Broken lock," he said, without giving me any further explanation. As I only needed a room to sleep and a corner to work, I accepted without question. But on the first night, something started to bother me. The apartment was too quiet. You could hear every creak in the building, the distant footsteps of neighbors, the muffled sound of cars on the street. But around 3 in the morning, a different noise came. Faint, but clear. A sound coming from inside the locked room. First, a slight dragging, as if something was moving inside. Then a gentle knock on the door. 3 spaced beats. My heart accelerated. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wood contracting from the cold of the night. But then the worst came. A muffled, wet sound. A cry. Low, choked, as if someone was trying to hold back their own despair. I lay frozen in bed, my entire body tense, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks. But the sound continued. The muffled crying turned to sobs, then whispers too low for me to understand. A shiver ran up my spine, and the only thing I could do was pull the blanket up to my neck and close my eyes tightly. I don't know how long I stayed there, motionless, waiting for it to stop. At some point, silence returned and, exhausted, I ended up falling asleep. In the morning, everything seemed normal. The room remained closed, motionless, as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I had heard. The next day I called the owner, trying to be casual. I asked again about the room, if he was sure that no one had access to the room. The answer came quickly, dryly. "It's locked. Don't try to open it." His tone was stricter this time, almost irritated. I could feel he wanted to close the subject, but that only increased my curiosity. I spent the rest of the day trying not to think about what had happened, but as night fell, an uneasiness began to grow inside me. And then, as the clock struck 3 in the morning, the sounds began again. The banging, the dragging, the crying. But this time, there was something different. I heard breathing, heavy, rhythmic, on the other side of the door. My heart raced. The breathing continued, slow and deep, as if something was listening to me on the other side of the door, waiting for some reaction from me. I sat on the bed, holding my breath without realizing it. Was I going crazy? Maybe it was a problem with the pipes, a strange echo coming from another apartment. But then, the knocking started again. 3 dry hits. Stronger, this time. I almost fell out of bed when I heard something new. The sound of the doorknob turning, as if someone was trying to open the door from the inside. My stomach sank. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Someone, or something, was there. Curiosity mixed with fear began to eat away at me. My body wanted to run out of that apartment and never come back, but my mind insisted that I needed to see what was behind that door. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, I went to the high, locked door and put my ear to the wood. Absolute silence. But without knowing why, I reached for the doorknob. Cold. Property. And then on the other side, something did the same. A light touch. A finger, perhaps, pressing against the wood at the same height as my hand. My blood ran cold. I jumped away, my heart hammering in my chest. I needed to open that door. I spent the day trying to convince myself that this was a bad idea, but it was like an itch in the back of my brain, an obsession that grew and grew. Who was inside? What was calling me? When night fell, I had already made my decision. I took a hairpin that I found in the kitchen drawer and started to pry the lock. My heart was beating so hard that I could barely breathe. The mechanism was old and rusty, but after a few minutes, I heard a click. The lock came loose. I stood there for a few seconds, my hand sweating on the doorknob. The door didn't open on its own. Whatever was in there, it was waiting for me to open it. Swallowed hard and, with a hesitant movement, pushed the door open. The room was dark, the air heavy and cold, as if no one had been in it for years. The smell was strange, musty mixed with something sweet and rotten. My eyes took a while to adjust, but as the dim light from the hallway filled the space, I began to see. The room was furnished like an ordinary bedroom, with an iron bed in the corner, an antique closet, and an oval mirror against the wall. But something was wrong. The covers were wrinkled, as if someone had just left there. And then, in the middle of the floor, I saw something that made me catch my breath. Brands, handprints, scratches spread across the floor, as if someone had been dragged inside, or tried to get out. A shiver ran up my spine. My eyes followed those marks on the floor, the jagged scratches that looked like they had been made by human fingernails. I took a hesitant step into the room, feeling the air thicker, almost sticky. The silence was so profound that I could hear my own heart beating in my ears. I approached the oval mirror leaning against the wall, the wooden frame worn and stained with time. The surface reflected only my own image, pale and tense. But then, for a brief second, something changed. A dark figure passed behind me. My entire body froze. I turned around quickly, but the room was still empty. That's when I realized the worst part. The iron bed in the corner was not empty. The mattress dipped slightly, as if someone invisible was lying there. My blood ran cold. I tried to swallow my fear and take a step back, but before I could, the mattress sank even lower. As if something, or someone, was getting up. That's when I heard it. The same muffled crying from the night before, now loud, coming from all corners of the room at the same time. The mirror began to fog up, as if someone was breathing on the other side. My legs finally reacted. I turned on my heel and ran for the door, but before I could leave, I felt something grab my wrist, cold, bony, impossible. A whisper cut through the air beside me. "You shouldn't have opened it." I screamed and yanked my arm away, stumbling out of the room and slamming the door behind me. My chest was rising and falling quickly. My skin was cold where that thing touched me. But the worst was yet to come. The muffled cry turned into something deeper, a guttural sound, almost a moan of pain. Then, the door started to shake, first lightly, then hard. Something on the other side was trying to get out. I ran to the kitchen and looked for something, anything, to lock the door. But before I could react, I heard a loud crack, like a bone breaking. And then, silence. My breath caught in my throat. For a few seconds, the only thing I heard was my own heart pounding. Then a slow creak. The doorknob was turning by itself. I knew I needed to run, but my body wasn't responding. And then, the door started to open, inch by inch, creaking, as if the building itself was resisting. The room was completely dark now, a black hole that seemed to swallow any light. And then, in the midst of that darkness, something emerged. One hand, bony, with fingers that were too long, sliding along the wood of the door. I didn't wait to see more. I ran out of the apartment barefoot, down the stairs like a madman. I didn't stop until I was outside the building, panting, feeling the cold early morning air burn my lungs. I stood outside the building for a while, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, my mind was spinning. I needed to get out of there, leave that apartment and never look back. But before I could make a decision, I felt my cell phone vibrate in my pocket. I answered without thinking, still in shock. On the other end of the line, the owner's voice came dryly, bluntly. "You opened it, didn't you?" My stomach sank. How did he know? I couldn't respond. I could only breathe heavily, trying to understand what was happening. "Go away, now. Don't go in there anymore. If you're smart, never come back." And then he hung up. I didn't need any more warnings. I hurriedly picked up my things the next day, without looking at the closed bedroom door, without even going into the apartment much. The feeling that something was watching me was suffocating. I moved to another neighborhood, another building, but I never got rid of the feeling that I brought something with me. Every now and then, at night, when everything is quiet, I hear knocking. 3 spaced beats. And if I look in the mirror, sometimes for a split second, I see something standing behind me. I've been living alone for a little over a year, but my mother still has a habit of showing up unannounced. At first, I found it a little annoying, but I ended up getting used to it. She has a copy of the key and always says, "It's for emergencies," but most of the time she just shows up to fix something or leave food in the fridge. So that night, when I arrived late and saw a note from her on the kitchen table, I wasn't surprised. "I came by to drop off some things. I'll leave before you arrive. Kisses, Mom." Normal. I threw the keys on the table and went straight to get something from the fridge. But while drinking a glass of water, I heard the first sound coming from upstairs. Steps. I stopped immediately, holding the glass in the air. More steps. Slow, heavy, as if someone was walking in my room. My heart jumped in my chest, but I quickly tried to calm down. Of course, my mother must still be there. Perhaps she had forgotten something. I picked up my cell phone and dialed my father's number, just to confirm. When he answered, I said casually, "Is Mom still here?" There was a pause on the other side. "What? Like this? She has been with me since the afternoon." My stomach turned. "But—" I started to respond, looking at the note on the table. Before he could finish his sentence, the footsteps returned, only this time. They were coming towards the stairs. My body locked up. The phone was still at my ear, but I could barely hear what my father was saying. The only thing I could focus on was the sound of the footsteps, slowly descending, one by one. The wooden floor creaked under the weight of whatever was there. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. My gaze automatically went to the stairs, and that's when I saw it. At the top, standing in the shadows of the hallway, there was something there. A shadow. Tall, still, completely silent now. It wasn't my mother. It wasn't anyone I knew. Just a dark silhouette, watching me. An icy shiver ran down. My spine and my heart skipped a beat. I wanted to look away. I wanted to run. I wanted to do something. But it was as if that invisible gaze kept me stuck in place. The thing didn't move, but I felt like it was analyzing me. Who knew that I knew? My chest was rising and falling rapidly, and it was at that moment that I realized the phone was still in my hand. My father was speaking on the other end, asking if I was okay, but my voice wouldn't come through. Then, in a desperate move, I looked at my mother's note again. My hands were shaking when I picked it up. And that's when I noticed. The handwriting wasn't hers. The paper slipped from my fingers. My entire body was filled with a cold that wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, more instinctive. Like I had just realized I was in on something so much bigger and wrong than I could understand. The steps had stopped. The shadow remained motionless at the top of the stairs. but now I felt that the thing was waiting for some reaction from me, as if he wanted to see what I would do. Every part of me screamed not to look away, to not give her the chance to move. My lungs hurt. I was holding my breath without realizing it. That's when the light flashed. Just a second. A quick flash. And when it returned to normal, the shadow was no longer there. The upstairs hallway was now empty. My throat went dry, and for a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it all. But then came the sound. A low, almost imperceptible noise coming from some dark corner of the house. Like a hushed whisper. Something that sounded like an echo of a voice. But it wasn't my mother, or my father, or anyone I knew. I didn't stay to find out what it was. I grabbed my keys and walked out the door without even looking back. I ran to the car and got in so fast I could barely put the key in the ignition. My hands were shaking so much that I had to take a deep breath to keep the engine from stalling. When I finally managed to start the car, I looked at the living room window, hoping to see something. But the house was just the way I left it. No lights on upstairs, no shadows visible. But I knew. I knew it was still in there. It wasn't imagination, it wasn't paranoia. I had heard. I had seen it. It made sense. The house, which until that night had been my refuge, now seemed like a place I never wanted to set foot in again. I drove to my parents' house without looking in the rearview mirror once. When I arrived, I made up some excuse not to come back that night. I never told my mother the truth. She kept going there sometimes, and nothing strange happened afterward. At least, not that I know of. But one thing still haunts me. The note. The next day, when I went back to get some things, he was no longer at the table. I looked everywhere, but it was as if I had never existed. To this day, I don't know what was with me that night. But whatever it was, I knew how to imitate my mother's handwriting. We have always been a united group. Me, Caio, Renata, and Bruno, friends since college. Every year we took a trip together, a silly tradition, but one that kept our friendship strong. That year, we decided to spend a weekend at Caio's family's country house, a place far from the city, surrounded by trees, and far from any sign of civilization. The perfect kind of place to relax. The road to get there was winding, full of sharp curves and few streetlights. When we arrived, the sun was already setting, turning the sky a deep orange. The house was old but comfortable, and we soon settled in, excited for an evening of drinks and conversation. We had no idea what awaited us. Around midnight, we were already spread around the room, laughing and remembering old stories when Bruno's cell phone vibrated. He frowned and picked up the device. "Unknown number," he murmured, showing us the screen. Nobody paid much attention. He rejected the call and we continued talking. But then, a few minutes later, the cell phone rang again. This time, it was Renata's. Same number. She also ignored it. We thought it was some prank, maybe a mistake, and we continued drinking. But then, almost at the same time, all of our cell phones started vibrating. A shiver ran down my spine. This was not normal. The mood changed instantly. Before we had been relaxed, laughing, but now there was a strange heaviness in the air. We all looked at each other, cell phones still vibrating in our hands. "This is really weird," I muttered, trying to sound calm but feeling a shiver run up the back of my neck. Caio was the first to reject the call. One by one, we did the same. The silence returned, but now it seemed different, as if the house was watching us. We tried to continue the conversation, but no one could really relax. Until Bruno's cell phone rang again. This time, he answered. "Hello," he said, his voice more tense than he would like to admit. Nothing. Just a heavy silence. Then one click. Call ended. Bruno cursed and threw the phone on the sofa. Are you kidding me? Renata laughed nervously. Guys, it must be just a prank. But the truth is, none of us believed that. The cell phone signal there was weak. It barely reached the internet. And even so, we were receiving simultaneous calls. No one wanted to admit it, but something wasn't right. The discomfort increased when cell phones rang again, this time all at the same time. I froze, heart racing. The shrill sound of ringing echoed through the dark house. We looked at each other, and it was Bruno who decided to answer again. He put it on speakerphone. "Who's talking?" he asked, his voice already full of irritation. The answer came in a faint, almost inaudible whisper. "I'm right here with you." The silence that followed was absolute. We all stood still, as if our brains needed time to process what we just heard. My heart was beating so hard that I could feel the blood pulsing in my ears. Bruno hung up the phone in a sudden movement, his fingers shaking. "What the fuck was that?" Nobody responded. We just stood there exchanging looks, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe some neighbor was playing with us, some crazy person from the city trying to scare tourists. But then, something happened that made any logical excuse disappear. The house's landline phone started ringing. The sound was loud and sharp, shattering the silence in the room. We looked at each other, the tension in the air becoming unbearable. No one wanted to answer, but we knew that ignoring wouldn't make it stop. Kaio took a deep breath and walked to the phone, picking up the receiver with a hesitant hand. He put it to his ear and said, "Hello?" Almost whispered. What came next made the blood run cold in our veins. The same voice, now closer, clearer. "I'm looking at you." Kaio dropped the phone as if he had been shocked. The sound on the line became full of static before a click dry-ended the call. The phone went silent. But we knew we were not alone. That sentence was enough to take away any trace of courage we still had left. We all stood there, standing still, not knowing what to do. The phone was dead, but the feeling of being watched was almost palpable. Renata started looking around, as if expecting to see someone hiding in the corners of the room. I did the same. The house was old, but not that big. The front door was locked, the windows closed. No one could have gotten in without us noticing. But then came the sound. Something dragging across the floor upstairs. Slow, heavy, as if someone was moving without haste. The air became thick. Bruno whispered, "There's someone else here." But none of us had the courage to go up and check it out. We just listened. Steps. A slight creak from the wooden floor. Then silence. It was Renata who pointed first, to the living room door. The hinges creaked. Not because it was opening, but because someone on the other side was pressing against it. We were in shock, unable to react. Then came the worst part. Cell phones vibrated again, and before we could ignore it, all the devices picked up on their own. The voice came loud, this time without whispers. "I'm going in now." It was enough to break us out of our trance. Kaio ran to the door and turned the lock hard while Bruno grabbed a chair as if that could protect us from whatever was outside. I picked up my cell phone and tried to call the police, but the call just wouldn't go through. The signal, which was weak before, was now completely dead. The silence returned, heavy, suffocating. Then the door handle began to slowly turn. 1, twice. As if whoever was outside wanted to play with us. Renata let out a low sob, putting her hand over her mouth. We stood there, frozen, waiting. But the door didn't open. Instead, we hear a new sound, something sliding across the wood, nails or fingers running up and down the surface. Bruno couldn't take it. "Enough, fuck!" he shouted, and kicked the door hard. The sound stopped. The silence was absolute. We stood there, waiting for a response, anything, but nothing happened. After long seconds, Kaio, with a low voice, said, "I think he left." But before we could breathe a sigh of relief, we heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The landline phone rang again. This time no one answered. We just watched as he played and played, and then stopped on his own. Bruno's cell phone vibrated once again. One last message. No number, no sender. Just 2 words. I'm already in. A shiver ran up my spine. No one moved, no one breathed. The silence became unbearable. So we listened. The same sound as before. Steps, but now, inside the house. They came from the corridor that led to the rooms, slowly, dragging. The kind of sound you only hear when someone he wants that you realize it's there. My chest tightened. I looked around, trying to find some rational explanation, but deep down I already knew. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't someone out there. It was here with us. Bruno was gripping the chair so tightly that his knuckles were white. Renata was shaking. And then, in the mirror next to the bookshelf, I saw it. The reflection showed something that shouldn't be there. In the corner of the room, between us, there was a shadow. Long, distorted, still, watching. But when I looked directly at that corner, there was nothing. Despair took over. "Run," I whispered, and it was as if it woke us up. We opened the door and ran out into the cold night, without looking back. We only stopped when we reached the car. No one said anything until we were miles away from the house. We never went back. We never talked about it. But every now and then, in the middle of the night, my cell phone vibrates. Unknown number. And I never had the courage to answer again. I got home later than usual that night. The day had been hell at work, and all I wanted was to take a shower and fall into bed. But as soon as I parked in the garage, I realized something was wrong. The house was completely dark. No lights were on, not even the small LEDs on the appliances that were always flashing in the kitchen. I sighed, thinking it might just be a tripped circuit breaker. I took my keys, went in, and the silence inside the house felt heavier than usual. The feeling that something was out of place grew, but I ignored it. I went to the back, went out the door to check the breaker, and then I heard the click behind me. The door had locked itself. My stomach turned. I tried turning the handle, pushing, but it was firm. This had never happened before. My heart started to race when a thought hit me. What if I wasn't alone? I walked slowly to the living room window and tried to peek inside. At first I only saw darkness, but then a beam of light crossed the room. My blood ran cold. There was someone inside. A flashlight moved slowly, illuminating the bookshelf, the sofa, the table. It wasn't mine. My chest tightened with realization. Someone was in my house. My mind went into shock for a few seconds. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The beam of light moved slowly, as if the person inside was searching every corner of the room. My first instinct was to grab my cell phone and call the police. But when I reached into my pocket, I realized the worst. My cell phone was inside the house. I had left it on the table when I entered. My heart started to hammer against my chest. I looked around, looking for some way to get help. The street was deserted, with no living soul around. I was alone, outside my own house, while someone was going through my things inside. I tried to control my breathing and think clearly. Maybe if I could get to a neighbor. But before I could move, I saw another beam of light appear inside the house. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just one person. There were at least 2 intruders inside. I moved away from the window as quietly as possible, my hands sweating coldly. I didn't know if they had heard a noise, if they already knew I was out there. I felt like a cornered animal. Every second seemed to drag on like an eternity, and the panic only grew. I needed help. Now. My heart was pounding so loudly that I was sure anyone in the house could hear it. I looked around, trying to decide whether to run to the neighbors' house or hide until I was sure they were gone. But before I could make any decisions, I heard a noise coming from inside. A dull thud, as if something had been dropped. The sound was followed by hurried footsteps, and then absolute silence. Something inside me said they had noticed my presence. My stomach dropped, and the only thing that kept me from spiraling into pure despair was seeing a car coming around the corner, one of the few neighbors arriving late. Without thinking twice, I ran up to him and knocked on the window, desperately gesturing for him to stop. I quickly explained what was going on, and he didn't hesitate to let me use his phone to call the police. As I spoke to the attendant, my head was spinning. How had they gotten in? How did they know I wasn't there? Had they planned this? Within minutes, 2 police cars arrived, and the police entered the house. I stood outside, the chilly night air not being enough to alleviate the heat my body felt. When one of the police officers came out and said there was no one else inside, a mix of relief and discomfort washed over me. They were gone, but they had been there, going through my things. And I had no idea what they might have taken or left behind. After the officers checked the entire house and confirmed that the intruders were gone, they let me in to see if anything had been taken. The room looked exactly as I had left it, and for a moment, I began to wonder if my mind had exaggerated everything. But then, when I went up to the bedroom, I noticed that my drawers were open. Some clothes were thrown on the floor. They had been there, searched through my things. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. The cops said they probably ran away when they realized I was outside, but something didn't add up. They seemed to have plenty of time before I arrived, as if they knew exactly the right time to leave. It was only the next day that I realized the most frightening detail. I decided to check the security cameras, still feeling uneasy. As I scrolled through the images, seeing the empty and dark house before my arrival, my blood ran cold. The invaders hadn't just entered when I arrived. They had been inside for at least 40 minutes, which means if I had arrived 5 minutes earlier, I would have run into them. The idea of being locked in there with those people, with no way out, bothered me. Haunts to this day. Since that night, I have never entered the house without checking the cameras first.